Hey, it's Debra with Traveling Well for Less. Today you'll learn which states you can travel to and which states require you to quarantine when you visit. If you're planning a summer vacation and had hoped to road trip the United States, in this video I'll show you why you might want to think twice about visiting certain states. You'll learn which states you can visit without restrictions and which states you'll want to avoid unless you plan on self-quarantining for 14 days. Be sure to watch the entire video because I also share which states are the best to visit because they have no quarantine orders and have the fewest cases of COVID-19. These 5 states require you to quarantine for 14 days. All visitors to Hawaii must quarantine for 14 days upon arrival. But starting August 1st, if you have proof of a negative PCR test from a CLIA-certified location, you can avoid the 14-day quarantine. Pro tip: testing upon arrival in Hawaii is not provided, so you have to take the test before you leave your state. If you don't self-quarantine, you're subject to a $5,000 fine and/or a year in jail. Not worth it. If you arrive in Hawaii by boat and have been at sea for at least 14 days, you don't have to quarantine. Be sure to give a like or share in the comments if you're excited that Hawaii is lifting their mandatory 14-day quarantine starting August 1st. Alaska is another state that has a mandatory 14-day quarantine for travelers, unless you meet one of these 3 conditions. The first exception is if you provide a negative PCR coronavirus test that was taken within 72 hours to 5 days before leaving home. If the test is positive, you will not be allowed to enter Alaska. If the test is negative, you can retest once you arrive in Alaska. The state recommends you avoid others while you wait for your test results. You can also take this test when you arrive in Alaska if you register in advance and quarantine while waiting for your results. If the test is positive, you are required to self-quarantine for 14 days. The exception is if you're an essential worker or a member of the critical infrastructure workforce, which includes healthcare workers, public works workers, and a bunch of other job descriptions as included in the link below. And you have to follow your community protocol plan. The third exception to avoid the quarantine in Alaska is if you've had coronavirus and tested positive 3 weeks or more prior to arriving in Alaska, have no symptoms, and have a doctor's note. Then you do not have to retest once you arrive in Alaska. Maine requires all travelers to self-quarantine for 14 days unless you have proof of a negative PCR test taken within the last 72 hours prior to arrival in Maine. Pro tip: New Hampshire and Vermont residents are not required to self-quarantine when they visit Maine. Anyone, including residents who have flown into New Mexico, are required to quarantine for 14 days. Pro tip: airline employees, active duty military, essential workers, business travelers, and those under court order to come to New Mexico are exempt. Vermont visitors arriving by plane, bus, or train must quarantine for 14 days. If you drive to Vermont, you do not have to quarantine if you have self-quarantined at home for 14 days prior to arriving in Vermont and you drove straight from your house to Vermont with no stops. That includes no stopping for gas, no stopping for potty breaks, no stopping for food. Road trippers who have stopped anywhere between their home and Vermont are required to self-quarantine for 14 days. Be sure and tell me in the comments if you're more or less likely to visit Hawaii, Alaska, Maine, New Mexico, or Vermont. These next 8 states require you to quarantine if you're coming from high-risk areas. Visitors to Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York, including residents coming from an area with transmission rates of 10 positive tests for every 100,000 residents, must self-quarantine for 14 days. As of June 24th, this includes anyone from these states: Alabama, Arkansas, Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, Washington, Utah, and Texas. Florida has a mandatory 14-day quarantine for visitors from Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York. Kansas residents must quarantine for 14 days returning from Alabama, Arkansas, South Carolina, and Florida. They also require that anyone who has traveled internationally or who have cruised on or after March 15th quarantine for 14 days. Anyone coming into Oklahoma on a plane from California, Connecticut, Louisiana, New Jersey, and New York is required to quarantine for 14 days. Pro tip: airline employees, active duty military, healthcare workers, and emergency workers are excluded. Everyone coming to Rhode Island from a state with a positivity rate of 5% or more has to quarantine for 14 days or provide proof of a negative PCR test taken within 72 hours prior to arrival in Rhode Island. These states include Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas, California, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Iowa, Kansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, Nebraska, Nevada, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Oregon, Puerto Rico, South Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, and Washington. Pro tip: you can take a test upon arrival, and if it's negative, you can stop quarantining. Anyone coming to Virginia who has traveled internationally, or you've been on a cruise ship or riverboat, or you've come from a high-risk area, is required to quarantine. Tell me in the comments, if you're coming from a state with a lot of COVID cases, would you visit another high-risk state? These 9 states expect but don't require you to quarantine. Travelers are expected but not required to self-quarantine for 14 days when you visit Massachusetts. Pro tip: essential workers are excluded. If you're visiting for less than 14 days, Nebraska expects you to self-quarantine. This also applies to residents who have traveled internationally. Pro tip: healthcare workers, commuters, and some other groups are excluded from the mandatory quarantine. Visitors to New Hampshire should, but aren't required to self-quarantine if staying in New Hampshire for longer than 14 days. Arkansas has lifted their mandatory 14-day quarantine for visitors, but asks residents to self-quarantine if returning from affected areas. Residents of Maryland with symptoms of coronavirus are recommended to self-quarantine for 14 days when returning home. South Carolina visitors and residents who are returning from a high-risk area are recommended to quarantine while in South Carolina. Utah visitors and residents who have been in high-risk areas are asked to self-quarantine for 14 days. Residents of West Virginia who visit crowded areas are recommended to quarantine. The state of Wisconsin doesn't have a statewide plan of mandatory quarantine, but they've left it up to individual cities and counties to determine specific guidelines. You should check with each city or county you plan to visit while in Wisconsin. Pro tip: The state has recommended that people do not travel to second homes or vacation cabin rentals. This reduces the impact on rural and tribal communities in those areas. Tell me in the comments if you would voluntarily self-quarantine. These 25 states do not have quarantine orders, but are medium to high risk based on the number of coronavirus cases they currently have. These include Alabama, Arizona, California, Colorado, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kentucky, Louisiana, Michigan, Mississippi, Missouri, Nevada, North Carolina, Ohio, Oregon, Pennsylvania, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, and Washington. These next 3 states don't have quarantine orders and have fewer cases of coronavirus: North Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana, with Montana having the least amount of COVID-19 cases in the entire United States. Tell me in the comments which states you plan on visiting this summer. Be sure you like this video because it really helps the channel a lot. And if you've enjoyed this video and the other videos I've created, remember to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.